draft schooling. On this week's episode of the Fantasy Ruckers Show, we bring on John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning to give us a lesson about the top players coming from this year's 2023 MLR Collegiate Draft and the fantasy impact that they will have. And our off-season final fantasy ranking reveal continues. And this week, it's all about the top fantasy second rowers from the past season. The Fantasy Ruckers Show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 77 of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. Matt Yee, Devin Vanderpool, I am Ryan Yee here with you as always. And guys, we're in the midst of our fantasy rankings rugby reveal. It's been an interesting one. Got through the front rows last week. We got second rows this week, and we also had a little bit of MLR Collegiate Draft to sprinkle in there as well. And like I alluded at the top of the show, we got a special guest here to help us navigate through what has been a very interesting and weird 2023 Collegiate Draft. But guys, I mean, it is the rugby off season, it is the MLR off season, but doesn't feel like it. A lot going on here.
There is a lot going on. I feel like, we got a lot to talk about. The draft sneaked up on us like out of nowhere. And I mean, frankly, we've been showing some pretty ill words towards it, but that might be just me. But yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward to learning about the draft, learning about some players, learning about who the heck I should look for in the fantasy. Maybe none of them. Maybe I should be looking out for none of them, which I'm probably presuming. But it'll be good to have Fitzy on here. I think it's the first time since we've chatted since the old 2023 season happened. So, I mean, I didn't want to bring it up, but
yeah. Well, you were alluding to it, but to all the fans, sorry if I'm sniffling a little bit. I had my sister's wedding over the weekend, and I thought it was a hangover, but it's not. I'm a little bit sick here.
Brutal, buddy.
Yeah, I feel brutal. So.
Oh, perfect.
But
inside matches, yeah.
But hey, rugby don't sleep. Neither do I. Let's go.
Let's go. All right. Well, yeah, like I said, jam-packed show. We got our off-season fantasy rankings reveal continues. Got second row in this one. Obviously going to go over all the latest news and notes. And like we said, collegiate draft happened last week. Got a special guest, John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning, to join us to help us break it all down. But before we get into any of that, like we say every single show, make sure you're giving us a follow on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers on Instagram, YouTube, and X. Still getting used to it. And X.
It's Twitter.
And if that's not enough for you, you can also give us a look at our Discord channel. Got a wonderful community over there that's talking fantasy rugby, talking Major League Rugby, talking all of rugby that's going around. I'm sure with the World Cup also coming up around the corner here, there'll be a lot of chatter in there too. And we also got a website that'll be good for anyone who loves Major League Rugby. You can check out there, see how all the players did this past season, and break it all down if you're having a little bit of a feeling of missing the Major League Rugby about 2 or 3 weeks away. So got that all there. Make sure you're checking all that out. All right. Let's get into it, and let's start off with some news and notes. But again, I know we brought on John Fitzpatrick Rugby Morning for the collegiate draft, but who better to bring on our news and notes segment than the guy that curates the best morning email news rugby paper, I call it article, all the latest news that you have there from North American rugby and beyond, John Fitzpatrick himself. So John Fitzpatrick, welcome to the show, Rugby Morning. Always love you having on as always. How are you doing, John?
Rigged. The championship fantasy final was rigged in my favor.
That was a pretty long clap for a second place runner-up.
Such bull crap. I propose a new league rule that the championship is 2 weeks, not just 1 week. I clearly had the better team at the latter half of the season. I got gypped because of some lineup decisions. It should be a 2 week contest.
This is a whole different Fitzy. I remember before the finals, it was, I got nothing to lose. All the pressure's on you. What happened? And it's all turned backwards. How the turntables, Fitzy. How the turntables.
Andy agrees with
But
me.
hey,
Yeah.
Hey, it's great.
Hey,
It's great to have you back.
It's just, funny that his brother's the commissioner. He goes from 0 to hero.
Whatever.
Just like that.
Whatever.
Okay, let's get that out of here. I run a tight ship here. All right, I'm a man of the people.
That's
No
right.
favoritism
If
If
Almost
you,
as
involved.
if you
tight as
stack
the
up the
Titanic.
records, I guarantee you, Maddie still has the worst winning percentage out of
He
the
probably
2-year
does.
folks.
I don't want to talk about
He
that. I
probably
don't even
does.
remember that year.
All right, well, let's get into it. Fitzy, again, as always, love having you on the show. And before we get to all the collegiate draft stuff, that we're gonna lean on you to give us a little bit of tidbit here on how we even perceive this draft and how the heck it means anything here in the world of fantasy MLR. But before we get into that, let's break down some of the latest news and notes. And all this stuff has been included in that wonderful newsletter of yours that gets emailed every single morning. Guys, if you're not doing it already, give this guy a follow at Rugby Morning on social media. Subscribe to his letter, rugbymorning.com. It's the greatest thing to have with a nice cup of coffee in the morning to get in the know with all the things latest in the rugby world in North America and beyond. So Fitzy, the first thing that we want to get into here is Rugby Atlanta is on the move, and we talked about it last episode. We didn't know exactly where there was rumors.
We nailed it.
We Brian Ray is a trusted source around Major League Rugby world, and hey, he was right. They're moving to Los Angeles for the 2024 season. Interesting again. I mean, we talked about last show going from that whole crazy rebranding that Rugby Atlanta did to now being in a completely different city.
They're rebranding again.
I guess so.
Back to back.
Sorry, was there a question in there? I apologize.
No. It's just, hey, what's your reaction? You excited to have a team in Los Angeles again? I mean,
Yeah.
last time we had one in Los Angeles, it didn't end so well.
This is where teams go to die.
Yeah.
LA is where teams go to die.
Where they win
And this
championships.
one, well,
The city of fallen angels, baby.
Yeah,
At
we'll
what
see.
cost? At what cost?
We'll see
of the
this team win.
championship?
We'll see this team win one, and then Gilchrist will come in here and sweep it up and put it in the garbage, just like he did with the last LA team.
So,
Look, I heard the new owners of the LA team are the owners of Gold's Gym. So hopefully they do a better job than F45. No, I'm just kidding.
So Reichard Hadding's going there then.
Oh,
Ooh,
That was tough. Sorry.
cheap shot.
Yeah.
Shameful. I mean, it's too bad what happened in Atlanta. I think there's a good rugby scene in Atlanta. Unfortunately, it didn't go very well, and I think that's because the ownership group that was in Atlanta had their eyes on New England, right? Because the operative owners of Rugby ATL over the last year were the owners of the New England Free Jacks, right? And that was common. It's happened in a lot of different sports. MLS, there were a number of different owners who owned multiple stakes in teams, so it clearly just wasn't viable there. Will a team come back to Atlanta? I'm optimistic, but I think it's exciting, right, for a rugby team to be back in LA and big market, the glitz, the glam, Hollywood. We'll call them the Yee-Teenies maybe or something like that. It'll obviously be a fruit. It'll be a fruity drink. That
I don't think I have enough. I don't have enough money. As much as I'd love to own an MLR team, I don't think I have enough money to buy a team to call them the Yee-Teenies. But hey, that's a great idea, Fitzy. I will say this is what you
guys
get
be
though.
seltzer guys for sure.
whatever.
This is what you get though for taking one of the best branded teams in the MLR with Rattle. I loved the branding before it until they switched it all over. Hey, get them to LA, retry it. Let's see what it goes. But again, just something to quickly add there to that as well. I will say the United States Rugby Players Association coming out with a statement there. I know, Fitzy, you've been on top of this pretty good here, but they have said, hey, the MLR, which is not something that you're hearing a lot of the time, but the MLR is providing some transparency here. And apparently they've answered 9 out of the 13 questions that Rugby Atlanta players had.
It's a passing grade, right?
It's a passing grade. It's above 50%.
Sounds like my high school marks, eh?
Yeah. Had about the relocation to Los Angeles. They say it's a good step moving forward. Obviously, they still have some concerns, but hey, at least they're slowly starting to get on the same page.
I just don't understand, though. I mean, when I say that LA is a place where teams go to die, I mean, you think of it financially. You think of the cost of trying to rent out a stadium. You think the competition between every LA sports team and every major American sport. You think of the cost of living, like the rugby union was talking about, how it's going to be a severely increased cost of living. It's not just a cost of living for the players. The organization has to support these guys as well. It's just Rugby Atlanta, to Fitzy's point, it was a good atmosphere and a good rugby kind of city and it served the MLR well. And for it to go to LA, I think it'll be interesting to see how this pans out.
Yeah.
And it'll just be interesting to see, you know, we also have a Miami team. So like our players going to be choosing a Miami team over LA, you know, but we'll see.
No taxes in Florida.
It'll be interesting.
No taxes in Florida.
Yeah, but you know, Maddie, I think you're right though. I think they can't play at the Coliseum again. They were dwarfed by it. It was too big. And if I'm a betting man, and I am, I'd say they settle somewhere kind of in that Long Beach, maybe Orange County, just south of LA, but it's still the LA region where you've got Orange County, you got, you've got some wealthy enclave out there. You've got some big rugby clubs out there that I could kind of see them settling in between, the lower part of the LA County, Orange County, maybe get some people up on the northern end of San Diego that don't want to make the drive down to the Legion. So, we'll see, but they can't play at the Coliseum.
As long as it's not as big of a hike to take a shot at your Old Glory DC boys, Fitzy. As long as it's not a big of a hike to get to Segra Field from DC, then I think we'll be okay. But yeah, it should be interesting to see kind of how it all plays out. Yeah. I mean, always excited to see how a team approaches new branding, what they're going to be called. I think the newest team, which we'll now get into here, has done a fantastic job with their branding. I love the colors. I love the logo. Miami Sharks rolls off the tongue. It's fantastic. So let's get into some of the news and notes there. With regards
this
to
episode sponsored by Miami Sharks.
I think we're starting to see some of the roster here starting to take shape. Last episode, we talked about the signings from that expansion draft, and hey, they're coming out with some additional signings. We got Philippe Echeverry signing with the Miami Sharks, fullback fly half, and we also got center scrum half Thomas Inciarte joining the Miami Sharks. So we're seeing it. Yeah, that is a weird combo. Center scrum half. You don't really see that.
Never find me in the center.
We're starting to see the Miami Sharks starting to take shape here and slowly getting a roster here for the newest team in the MLR.
I mean, we're starting to see their influences, that's for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, we got Thomas Cubelli with the early signing. We got 3 Uruguayans. They signed somebody else. I forget his name.
Manuel Ardao, if I'm
He's supposed to be stud.
Yeah.
Stud.
Young guy too, right?
Captain, 24 years old, captain of Peñarol, I guess one of the teams in Super Rugby Americas that won the championship or in the championship final. Yep. Named, as you said, to the Uruguayan Rugby World Cup squad. Like, he's like a dark horse, could be player of the tournament, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, it'll be interesting. Like, I think we kind of expected this too from the Miami Sharks, right? Like, we knew they were going to have South American influence. I'm more interested to see how they fill out this roster with North American talent. I mean, they have to.
Yeah.
They have to at some point. They made some draft picks. I know they made a couple signings through the expansion draft. Yeah. But they have to fill it out with North American talent here. They can't just keep, hoarding all the South Americans. So it'll be interesting to see how that goes.
Yeah, we'll see there. So yeah, the Miami Sharks roster taking shape here. It'll be interesting to see as the weeks go on how they kind of shape out. This one will kind of hit close to home here for you, Fitzy. Junior Sao, obviously a staple name here for Old Glory DC. Scored 12 tries for your squad there. 26 appearances between 2022 and 2023. Looks like he's moving on over at least for a brief amount of time to the Keeley Cougars overseas there. It'll be interesting to see whether or not it's something that returns. Matthew is saying that he feels like this has happened before. I know that the championship season runs through February and September, but it might be something to see where this shouldn't be too big of a concern, especially for fantasy managers who are looking to get Junior Sao back on their roster here in time for the 2024 year.
Yeah, it's interesting because Maddie's right. Junior played for the Keeley Cougars last year as well, and he joined it after the MLR season was over. So this announcement's kind of tricky. It's like, is he going to play there the full season? And obviously, there's an obvious conflict then, right? Because MLR starts in February. Or is he re-signed and then he'll join the Cougars after the MLR season is over? So, we'll wait and see. The other thing, though, is Junior Sao. I mean, he's getting up there in age. He's 35, 36. He's playing Union. He's playing League. That's a lot of wear and tear. You've got a new coaching staff there in Old Glory DC. Is Junior still part of the mix? I don't know. I mean, I think Junior would be a great addition to any team, and you'd love to see him stick around with Old Glory DC. But I don't necessarily think that means that he's not coming back next year. even though he's re-signed with the Cougars. So it's kind of a wait and see. Let's see how the rest of that roster comes together with the new coaching staff.
I will say we did see some pretty solid talent though coming through that back three position there for your Old Glory DC side. So I don't know, maybe just that competition. Maybe he thinks it's time to kind of move on to different things. We'll see. And again, just something that fantasy managers need to keep a lookout for. And I mean, in the past year, not the best fantasy season, wasn't necessarily the most available. 58.7 fantasy points as a total. Had 2 tries, 375 meters game, but did start every single match that he appeared in. So obviously a staple of that Old Glory DC lineup.
And Ryan, a couple things before we move to the draft. Even Matthews and Doug Fraser retired, announcing their retirement.
Mm-hmm.
Not that fantasy relevant, either of them. But I know at least Doug Fraser very familiar with a big part of that kind of Rugby Canada program. So it's congratulations to them on a great career kind of thing. But yeah, I just wanted to poke those in there before we get into the conversation on the draft.
All right. Well, yeah, let's shift on now that conversation to the draft. And that's why we brought on the bright-minded John Fitzpatrick from Rugby Morning to help us out here, because the question has been every single week.
That's the question.
Yeah, literally. It's been what the heck, because I think when you compare what we saw in the 2022 draft, and Fitzy, we had you on the show ahead of the 2022 collegiate draft, and we broke down some of these players, how excited we were for some of these guys. You saw some big time names leading up to the collegiate draft, guys that we thought, could eventually make a pretty solid impact in the world of the MLR. But this year, I mean, it was a tough one. You're not seeing the same names. James Dealey of MLR Stats tweet out there, I believe it's been a significant drop-off from the number of prospects that were declaring for this draft compared from 2022 year to this year. We even mentioned with Brian Ray mentioning it as well about some of the talent that he's seeing. I mean, I believe he listed in a tweet here that no UBC players, top school in Canada. Navy beat Cal in the D1A final, no Navy players, and only 1 Cal player. And we know that Sam Gold, last year's top draft pick, came from Cal last season. So obviously evident that there's this question when it comes to this player pool. So just before we start breaking down some of these players, Fitzy, I'd love to get your opinion on kind of what your mindset was and what your thinking perspective was of this collegiate draft leading up to last Thursday and what you were seeing up to that point.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think some of those concerns are legitimate. But other points that were brought up, I did a live draft show with Zach Lanning from the College Rugby Wrap-Up, and we talked about this, and he brought up a really good point, and others like Brandon Sparks, former Utah Warriors GM, that I think we're starting to feel the effects of the COVID year. So at least with American colleges and universities, a lot of those players were granted an extra year of eligibility. So I think they're taking advantage of it. So they're saying, well, yeah, why not? Why wouldn't you stay in college for an extra year to play rugby if you were given that option, right? If you're done most of your schooling, so you're there to just party and play rugby, yeah, sign me up for a 6th year of college,
yeah,
or
no
5th
doubt,
year or whatever. No, you know what I mean? Vandy's like, hell yeah.
Yeah, man, I didn't know that. I'm in.
Yeah, Vandy would go from scrum half to a prop and be like, well, we know what you did in your COVID year. Beer and hanging out with Reichard Hatting. But
that's right. Oh, baby.
So I think we're seeing some of that. Yeah, the numbers were down a little bit, and that could be, I think in years past, like there was the novelty of some rugby players saying, oh, I entered my name in the draft. And I think that novelty's worn off, where like maybe more legitimate players are doing it. I think something to keep an eye on. It'll be an alarming trend if it continues to go down next year and the year after. I do think on the Canadian side, it's a little bit different, because I think there was a drastic drop-off in Canadian talent. And I don't know if that's because it's that reflective of what's going on in rugby in Canada with the Arrows, with the fact that, you guys probably can't even beat Guam right now in rugby. So like, you know what I mean? Like,
shots fired.
I'm just kidding. No, I've got nothing but respect for Rugby Canada, even you 3 jackals. But you know what I mean? Like, it's tough times in Rugby Canada right now. So maybe they're like, hey, you know what? I don't want to put my name in the draft because I'd rather have some flexibility and kind of pick the team that I go to. Maybe I can move to a U.S. city. Maybe I've got a job offer or something like that, and latch on with the men's club team and then get noticed there. So, I mean, if the trend continues down for the next year or two, then it's really something to address. But I think we're seeing the effects of COVID.
But I mean, outside of the numbers, Fitzy, let's look, like, when we look at the talent of the pool, I mean, I personally haven't heard of him. I mean, we look at a guy like Ricky Rose or Max Schumacher, like, are these guys in comparison to the previous years when we look at, Connor Mooneyhams, the Sam Gallas, What is the comparison from your experience or view of seeing some of these guys?
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point, right? Like last year, I think everyone knew that Sam Gala was like the clear cut number one. Like Sam's definitely going, had the build, the prototypical build you want for a lock, and he slotted right in, like no problem. Like Dallas, boom, throw him in there. This year, from everything that I've looked at and read and others' opinion, it seems like there's a lot more quality of depth. You're seeing from rounds to 1 to 3, and one player in particular, Vandy, that I think you're going to really like is the brother of Mika Cruzet, Isaiah Cruzet, the wing from Fresno. Now Fresno's, I think, a D1 AA school, so he didn't play at like the top level of college rugby, but he dominated at Fresno. He's another guy now who's potentially going to team up with his brother in the Utah backfield. You can move him around. He can kick. He's fun to watch. He's got great ball skills. Like, I think there are pieces like that and others we can talk about where I think you're finding a lot more depth, because I think a lot of MLR GMs, I think they do value the draft. It's still so early, right? Like you could say it's kind of a crapshoot. Like, how do you identify, with the US and Canada being so big, all the different players that you need to look at? I think the Collegiate Rugby Shield continues to help, right? That's that competition that helps identify like top talent for MLR scouts to take a look at. So I think that's definitely helping. But I think you're right. There maybe not be like that sexy, like headline Sam Gala type number one. But I think we'll be surprised at the number of quality players that come out, and I think could even really have an impact, particularly in a fantasy where the stats have changed, right? With the meters and the tackles and all that stuff. That, like last year, I remember we were talking about like Sam Gala. I don't know if you draft Sam Gala because he's a lock and locks don't get a lot of points. And sure enough, he and Colin Gross, had pretty solid years as rookies. So I think we'll see a few of those this year. I'm happy to talk about more.
To that point, I mean, we never even mentioned Jack Shaw in any of our pre-draft, post-draft conversations. And Jack Shaw was a guy that I know I picked up at some point in the year.
For a bit too.
I know, Vandy, you had him. I mean, everybody kind of had a piece of Jack Shaw because he had his games. And it seems like, if I'm hearing you right, that this is kind of what we may be able to expect from this year. Maybe there's not a Sam Gala, maybe there's not a Colin Gross, but there are guys that we're still going to be able to have an impact on some of these teams and some of these games as well.
Yeah, I think so, for sure.
Should be interesting. Now, before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of this draft, you kind of mentioned it there, Fitzy, but what's your opinion on kind of what you think, at least how teams value this draft in terms of building through it? I know Vandy, as him being a fan of other sports like football, hockey, and things like that, there's obviously a big emphasis on building through the draft, and there's a lot of value when it comes to draft picks. But we saw leading up to this draft that guys were shipping off picks for peanuts and just trying to get rid of them, and we saw it evidently with the Arrows, who were more than happy to give away that second overall pick. Other teams, Seattle was shipping a bunch of the picks, but we did see, I mean, an argument to that, NOLA collecting a lot of picks there too. So just that sentiment there when it comes to the value of this draft, when it comes to building, is it something that people can, or teams can, rely on to find this talent, or is it just something that will supplement what ultimately has always been a piece of rugby, is building through a farm system, building through an academy system, and collecting talent at the younger levels, and then supplementing that with the draft? What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think we're probably still in the supplemental stage of this because it's still so early, but the draft process is such a uniquely American sports concept that the average American sports fan or Canadian sports fan can understand, right? Like through the NFL, NBA, NHL, all that stuff. Like, people understand the draft process, and it's a fun way to get players. And of course, there's the academy system, and there's international players that are going to come in. But I think a lot of this still is making it a marketing event for the league. So if people stumble upon it, they're like, "Oh crap, MLR has a draft. Oh, that's cool. Let's check this out." Right? Like, how can we get more people talking about college rugby and blowing that up? So I think we're still kind of in that supplemental stage of building a roster, but some teams, particularly like NOLA Gold, seem to value it. The GM there, Fitzgerald, he seems to make some good picks, and he traded into the first round twice. They had 3 first-round picks on this one. I thought they had a really strong draft. DC traded their draft picks last year, but I thought they had a really good draft class last year. They didn't have any picks this year. Miami Sharks, they were the biggest question mark for me because, based on their roster construction, and they had a few names by then, I didn't think they were going to I didn't know what their draft strategy was going to be, and I thought they had a pretty top-notch draft. So I think it's a growing opportunity, but still very much supplemental. As okay, we can find some quality guys. We're gonna have to develop some, but others could be. We're just picking a name out of a hat maybe, and we'll see how this goes.
I mean, it looked good. And again, you're talking about exposure. I mean, airing on Fox Sports too. I mean, it's always good for the league to get that type of stuff. But I mean, let's talk about it now. You mentioned some of the teams there. I don't think we need to go through every single pick and every single player. But let's just try to go through some of the things that impressed you the most. And I know a couple days ago you came out with your draft grades, and you came out with who you thought kind of did the best here. So let's kind of go through that and let's try to see what your kind of mindset is there and some of the picks that kind of impress you from that standpoint. So you mentioned two of the teams that at the top of your list, Miami Sharks, you gave them an A grade. NOLA Gold, you gave them an A grade. Now, I will mention that I hope this is not reflective of the draft grades that you put out for our fantasy MLR draft, because clearly
what do you mean? Those are pretty good. Those are pretty good. The top guy in the draft there, I think, won.
That's fair enough. I think you'll be second guessing that, Fitzy, next year when you come out with one of those. But yeah, like I said, Miami Sharks giving the A grade, NOLA Gold coming out with the A grade. Talk about their drafts. Talk about the best picks that you have here. Matt mentioned Ricky Rose. Give us a little bit of outlook to what we can spec about Ricky Rose from a fantasy perspective, and then talk about NOLA Gold, their best pick that you listed there, Gabe Mawinga, I think, if I'm saying that correctly. What are your thoughts there with the two teams that you gave the top grade for?
Yeah, I think the Sharks had a really good draft. They had the first pick in each round, and they selected with the number 1 overall Ricky Rose, who I kind of think is in that Sam Gala mold, right? He's a big guy, 6'7", 240, 250 pounds. Apparently can move really well. And Maddie brought it up, right? Like, you're going to need domestic players that you can put in the match day roster. Seemingly a position like lock, where you just need a big guy who can move around, who's going to lift guys up. It seems like Ricky Rose is in that kind of that mold, and there's definitely a marketing opportunity there with Rose in Miami. Like, Maddie, if you're not on that, let's figure out how we can get Ricky Rose a Rose sponsorship. But I think he has an opportunity to start, and I'm not saying he's going to put up Sam Gala like numbers, but I think that's the path for him, right? Like, I think that's what Miami's envisioning. And then the rest of the draft was solid again. I mean, they stuck with the forward pack. Their next pick was Charlie Overton, a lock from Life University. Life's one of the top collegiate rugby programs in there. Charlie Overton, I think, was top 3 lock behind James Rivers, who San Diego drafted, who I thought they had a really good draft. And then their last pick was Setu Vole, a big prop out of Lindenwood. You can't go wrong going in with the forward pack there, particularly your first year in MLR. And then NOLA Gold. NOLA Gold only had 3 picks all draft, all in the first round. Julian Roberts, fly half out of Life. I think he's a fun guy to watch. He's a lefty kicker too, so there adds an element there. But he's got ball skills. He can run. It'll be fun to see. I don't know if he's necessarily going to be a fly half. He might be a little undersized for that, but he seems like a type of guy where, like, hey, let's try and get him on the field. Maybe he can play a little bit of wing, maybe fullback. Kean Darling, flanker, Lindenwood. Lindenwood, again, another top program. I think they had the most draft picks out of Lindenwood. Flanker, I mean, he's motor's got good size. And if you recall, NOLA traded Devin short to Seattle flanker. So Seattle's got a ton of flankers now. NOLA Gold short of flanker. Is Kean Darling going to step in right away? I don't know, but maybe an opportunity to compete. And then you brought up the hooker from BYU, Gabe Mahinga. He, I think, apparently is rated the top domestic prop. He actually played for the USA U23 squad. So you know how hookers sometimes, right? Like, if they're starting, and they get that line out and they just get on the back and they just maul it on over, the Nick Suchan, if you will, for Matty Yee, practically carried his team to a big championship final. He could be a guy, we'll see. Is he going to start right away? I highly doubt it. MLR, rookies in MLR don't necessarily start coming out of college, but be fun to see. And again, I think 3 young top American players that MLR fans should have their eye on. We'll see if some of those guys have an impact fantasy-wise.
I like your point about Miami. I mean, it seemed like when you look back, it was almost a strategy for them to pick guys who are not in major skill positions. 2 locks and a prop. And hey, look, that's where we're going to play our North American players. We're going to fill out all the skill positions because we know the talent that we can get in the back row, the 9-10 position, the back 3 in the centers with South Americans, guys that have proven skill in the Super Rugby America League and at the international level. And I think that's a good point. And now that you bring that up, it's kind of like, hey, do we look at these Miami Sharks guys with a little bit of a bigger fantasy lens just because we know that they might fill their roster with so many South Americans that they're going to have to play these North Americans if they do end up signing them, right? So I think
Naposki has a good chance of starting on the wing.
Yeah,
for sure.
That's true.
But I think you nailed it on the head. I think they can only start so many international slots on the match day roster that North American players are going to have to play. So there could be opportunities there for them.
This was a learning curve for me. I mean, I've been bashing this draft for the past 2 weeks here, and I've been bashing the talent, and probably just me not knowing the talent in this draft, really. So this was unreal for Fitz to come on here. I am still gonna say that I'm confused about how the fact that Gabe Casey can be drafted 2 years in a row. I don't get it. I don't understand. What's going on here?
Yeah. So what happened there was, right, you brought it up. Gabe Casey was drafted by the Toronto Arrows last year, didn't sign with the Arrows, so re-entered the draft. He was also kind of a little bit of an underclassman, or I think maybe he did a grad year, which enabled him to play one more year of college rugby in Canada. But how funny is it that New England, of course, drafts the Canadian players? Seemingly all the Canadian players are coming to New England. But he's a guy who, I know New England has Rue Milan and a couple other centers in there that can ball out. But Gabe Casey seems like a pretty legitimate player. But here's the player that I'm most excited about for New England is Junior Gaffa. He's a center from Brown. He's a football crossover. He played linebacker for the football team. He is Paul Lasike-esque in that he's got this similar size.
Salivating.
Football guy like Junior Gaffa, man. I'm telling you, he started. I don't know, but he's an exciting player. And they also picked up another guy. Two USA Rugby Sevens players got drafted. Will Chavalet, I can't pronounce his name correctly, but he's the USA Rugby Sevens guy.
French.
Noah Brown, who got drafted by the Chicago Hounds, he's a Sevens guy. They're going to have to make a decision of sticking with 7s or 15s. But I thought New England had a great draft. I gave them an A-. Again, they could be a little more risky, right? They just won a championship. Seemingly, they're not going to draft the guy who's going to come into the starting lineup. But they could maybe take a risky shot for a bigger payoff with a guy like Gaffa or something, or Gabe Casey. So.
Well, we'd love to break down every single team in terms of the grades you got here. But again, if you want that, you got to go subscribe to the Rugby Morning newsletter, and you got to go get that so you can go see the full breakdown because it's absolutely fantastic. But Fitzy, kind of to put it in a nutshell then, I know we talked about the highest grades that you've given here. Miami Sharks with that A grade, Noah Gold with that A grade. You mentioned New England Free Jacks. Any other teams that you can want to kind of highlight here that you think that did a solid job here? Or any, I would say even you alluded to it. I mean, you talk about some of the top players that you think are going to be fun to watch, especially from a fantasy perspective. You mentioned Junior Gaffa. You talk about kind of the opportunity that are coming for some of these rookies. Any guys that kind of pop off to you that I think that people should be looking at for the head of the 2024 fantasy MLR season?
Yeah, I'll bring up Vandy's second favorite team, the San Diego Legion.
That's first.
Right.
Well, we talked about Isaiah Cruzet. I think that's a guy to keep an eye on. I mean, if he can team up with his brother, that'd be a lot of fun. I know that's a really exciting and crowded back 3 there in Utah, but maybe he comes off the bench and provides 20, 30 minutes there. It'd be interesting to see him team up with his brother. Another player who has a brother in the MLR and who was a men's Eagle, but Tyren Al-Jabori, he was a wing out of Lindenwood, dynamic runner. I know San Diego Legion has got a very interesting back 3 there with Aoki and Nate Osberger, and they seemingly have some centers that can score at will. Do we know if Ma'ananu is coming back? Not exactly sure, but Al-Jabori is a guy who's probably more of a wing, but could play a little bit of center. He's exciting. Like I think he has an opportunity to have an impact. Houston, I really liked what Houston did. You mentioned the Cal player Max Schumacher. I got to say, there were a number of fly halves that were drafted over the first couple of rounds compared to last year where there wasn't really that many fly halves drafted. There were a few this year, but also because I think there's some position flexibility they have where they can play a little bit of wing, maybe a little bit of fullback. But Max Schumacher, fly half fullback out of Cal for the Houston SaberCats, great landing spot for him. If he can kind of learn from Davey Koitzer, maybe develop over a year or two, Max Schumacher, is he the next great American fly half? I don't know, but he's an exciting prospect. I also think the flanker that they drafted out of life, Oren Beezer. Houston, they seemingly love flankers that are just mean and nasty and aggressive and play that South African style. I don't think he's as big as your typical South African flanker, but he's a guy to keep an eye on. And I'll give you one more name. And I don't know if he's going to play or not, but one of my favorite I'll give you two more names. One of my favorite players in the draft, Jackson Zabarick. He's a hooker out of Santa Cruz. I think I butchered his last name. The dude runs like a bull on a crowded street in Pamplona. I mean, like running of the bulls. Like the dude looks for contact. He also played 7, so he's got a motor, but he hits people and hits people hard. I love him. So I'm looking out for him. I don't know if he's going to play or not, but my second favorite player, definitely Maddie's favorite player, the New York Ironworkers drafted a prop out of Hofstra. I know that's your boy, Ryan Yee, right there.
Alma mater.
You got to say his name because his name is hilarious.
Gurji Bakuku.
Yes.
I got that name right.
Yeah,
I got that name right. No, I mean, who would have thought? I said when James Dealey's MLR stats tweets out that a guy from Hofstra is getting drafted to the MLR, a team that's not even in the NCAA. I know that Gurji is an Albanian player that was part of the New York Foundry Academy team. So obviously the connection, that's probably where he's getting most of his rugby. Believe me, he's not getting his high-level rugby from the Hofstra men's rugby club team. But I got to show it off here, though. I'm all about Hofstra, so I love to see it. But yeah, it's interesting stuff. Gurji Bakuku. I'll say it over and over and over again. Excited to see what he's got. So for sure. But I guess to wrap things up here, Fitzy, again, very enlightening. It'll be interesting. So I think time will tell. I mean, what this draft really brings. I think there's a couple notes there. I think one storyline that's going to be interesting to follow coming out of this is obviously what we're talking about. Again, the value of this draft, seeing what players are going to really be impactful for these teams. Are these going to be crucial guys that are going to really be implemented into the club, that are going to be the foundation of these rosters? And then obviously translates out to fantasy impact and their relevance in fantasy. But I think another interesting storyline here is going to be that trade. It was a big time trade, obviously bringing Robbie Povey over to the Toronto Arrows using that second overall pick. Now they obviously exchanged with a fly half that they're drafting Schumacher there for. So in the long run, who's going to really benefit from that? So that's going to be interesting as well. Final question for you, Fitzy. If you had to say over under players that are going to be impactful from a fantasy perspective from this rookie draft, the number is 3. That's the 3 that come to mind for us last season. We had Sam Gala, Colin Gross, and Jack Shaw. Are we over under 3 for this year's draft in terms of fantasy impact that are going to be on fantasy rosters consistently? And I'll probably say if we're to look back here and reflect from a year later, these guys have to be on fantasy rosters at the end of the season.
I think the odds maker set a really good line. I think the line is probably right at 3. So I'm going to go push. This is the push.
Oh, no.
I think it's going to be right at 3.
You're the worst type of betting man.
If you had to pick the 3 names that you think are going to be fantasy impactful, what are those 3 names? I'm not going to let you off the hook. I'm not let you going to go push and not give me those 3 names. So tell me who you think those 3 players are going to be.
Yeah, I'll do 4. I'll take the over then. Actually, I'm a gambling man. I think Ricky Rose. I think he's got a good shot there.
Okay.
I'm going to go with I think Isaiah Cruz from the Utah Warriors. I think
Vanny's already put him on. Vanny's already put it on his draft board. He's drafting Mika and Isaiah back to back.
I think Tyran Al-Jabori. I think he's an athlete. I think he's got a good opportunity. That's 3 right there. And then there's probably a couple other guys you could throw in the 4 to 5 mix. If Junior Gaffa sees the field for New England, the center, who's that Paul Asike-esque, I think he could potentially, if he can crack in there, I know it'll be difficult. I think he could put up some interesting numbers. we didn't really talk about James Rivers. He was the lock that San Diego Legion drafted. I know it's tricky there. There's some quality locks for San Diego, so it's going to be a little crowded. But if you can find some playing time, throw him in there. I want to say Max Schumacher, but I just don't know if he is going to see a lot of the field, particularly at fly half. I mean, that's Cloisters he's got the lockdown on that. So yeah, I think we're right at 4, but who knows? Like a guy like Colin Gross wasn't.
The bookies are making you sweat, Fitzy.
Well, so like a guy like Colin Gross wasn't exactly expected to start and play and get a lot of playing time. Injuries caused him to start in week 1, and his first touch in MLR was a try against the Chicago Hounds. So could there be a player like Colin Gross who finds an opportunity early to really set himself up and make an impact on fantasy? Possibly. So I'll take the over. I'll take over 3. Making an impact.
Right. So
come back to this in a couple weeks.
Yeah, exactly. So all the Fantasy Ruckers League members, all the ones in the future who are hoping to be able to play fantasy MLR in the upcoming 2024 season, if you draft any of these guys next year and they don't do anything for you,
Fitzy.
you know who to call, and you know who to thank. But anyways, give this guy a subscription on his newsletter anyways with that, because it's all some interesting content. Again, Fitzy, we appreciate your insight into this. Obviously, so knowledgeable about this the collegiate scene, both in America and a little bit in Canada too, with some of the Canadian players as well. I'll give you a little bit of credit there. But yeah, I love coming you on. I love when you come on here and give us the insight. I think it a little bit
dicey there.
Dicey.
Scott Bowers, hooker drafted by Seattle, could maybe make some noise too. Apparently he's the top Canadian hooker, so I'll throw that out there.
Got it. All right. Well, hey, Fitzy, really appreciate you coming on here, man. Again, a lot of insight, and again, if you're not following John Fitzpatrick's Rugby Morning, go give that a follow on all the social media channels. Go to rugbymorning.com, sign up for that newsletter. Sent out to you in your email inbox, curated nicely every single day. Very, very, very fun stuff. So Fitzy, appreciate you as always, man. And we'll have you on soon. And I know Matt loved to have you on too, to give you your final jab that he got one over you in the 2023 season here.
Always good seeing you, boys.
That's all I got for you.
All right.
Always good seeing you guys.
Always a pleasure, Fitzy.
Gurgy Bakuku.
Gurgy
Bakuku. Let's go.
And thank you again to Fitzy of Rugby Morning for joining us and giving us all the inside knowledge into the 2023 Collegiate Draft. Always good to have him on. And again, if you aren't following him already on socials, make sure you're doing that at Rugby Morning. And if you're not subscribed to that glorious newsletter that is sent out every single morning that gives you your curated rugby news that you need to know about everything going on about rugby with in North America and beyond, make sure you go do that. You can head to www.rugbymorning.com and get signed up for that. I'm signed up for that. Always good to have with that cup of coffee in the morning. Keeps you in the know. Always good stuff. Matt, and it's always good to see your fellow rival there, the guy that you took down in the 2023 Fantasy Ruckers League to win the championship. It's not much of a
rivalry, you know what I mean? Like, anything like that can't really be a rivalry. It's just another obstacle in the road.
We're only doing recency bias, Not last year, just this year.
It's just another obstacle in the road, Vandy?
Another obstacle.
Always going to be obstacles, buddy.
Always obstacles. All right. Well, hey, like we said at the beginning of the show, breaking down the collegiate draft, got that done. It is now time to continue our off-season 2023 top fantasy player rankings reveal. And we said last week we broke down all the front row players, and this week it's all about the second rowers. And this one's an interesting position, guys, because similarly to the front row, obviously the threshold of points here when it comes to the second row position is not necessarily the highest there, but it's still a position that you got to fill in your lineup, and there is always strategy that you need to put in place in regards to how you're going to approach the position, whether it's something like we mentioned last week, a position that you're going to punt. Is it going to be a position that you're going to kind of try to get that guy that is the X factor that will get you those extra points each and every week? It was an interesting approach this season for you guys, obviously, in the 2023 Fantasy Ruckers League. Before we break down our top 5 top fantasy MLR second rowers from the 2023 season, just your guys' perspective and your guys' thoughts on this second row position. Similar to the front row position, what was your kind of ideology here after going through this past season?
Second row. So front row is a little bit different because front row, there's some things that you can kind of rely on, which just the way that the set piece works, just the way that the front row position is. Second row here, the way that I went into it, I wanted to make sure I got my guy. And I made sure that I got the guy that I wanted in second row. Even though I wasn't going to get so many points from this position, I knew that, look, if I can get a guy that's going to be consistent, a guy that I know is going to be in the lineup, I could at least guarantee that I'm getting some production from that position. And that's kind of the way I went. I went with high floor, and a wishful ceiling kind of thing.
I was more of just like, I think I had 2, or I think I even had 3 second rows at one time, because
crazy.
There was something I felt always that they were better played per matchup. It wasn't really a set and forget type set and forget type player, but I truly think, like, not front row, second row, whichever one kind of you want to bank on more than one guy. I think that was the way to go.
Yeah, I mean, it was always tough if you didn't have that kind of all reliable guy, Matt, that you're alluding to. We can just say, I mean, you drafted Johan Mumsen, high second row player, I believe, drafted in our past 2023 fantasy draft heading into the year, drafted at that 4th round first pick. So obviously using that draft capital there, obviously coming off the 2022 season, had a big season, had that floor that you're talking about, and obviously had that potential from that second row position, who seemed to be able to break that gain line, able to rack up those meters gain. But different story, I think, heading into or finishing up in the 2023 year when it comes to the second row position. And we'll throw up the top 5 guys right now. It was an interesting one, and a very interesting name you're seeing at the top of the list there. Rookie of the year, Sam Gala, the top fantasy MLR second row, which is not surprising, but at the same time, heading into the season, I think would be pretty surprising going into it. But again, when you're seeing this list, I think there's an interesting sentiment that you're seeing here, is that very different from the previous past. Each of these guys that you're seeing has kind of a certain factor about them that makes them a little bit special at that second row position. And we're going to break down each of these players here. If you're listening on the podcast, we'll reveal them as we go. It was definitely interesting. And again, I think at least the common theme when you're looking at all these top 5 guys is the fact that availability. The guys, I mean, you look at Sam Gala, started in 15 matches, played in all 15 matches, big time there. And you look down the list, just a lot of guys playing those full 80 minutes, playing a lot of matches and starting in a lot of them. It led to a lot of reliable points being had consistently, at least for a second rower going through it. So to round out the list, our top 5 here, Sam Gala, like we mentioned, number 1 for the Dallas Jackals, drafted 1st overall heading into the season in the 2022 collegiate draft, racking up 135.6 fantasy points. Coming in right after him, Hunga Havili of the Utah Warriors. Vandy, you're sure happy to see that, 117.6 points for him. Johan Mumsen, Matt, the guy that you spent all that draft capital on, definitely not a loss there completely, sitting at that 3rd spot with 104.5 points. Hamish Dalzell, interesting name on the list there that we're going to break down, of the New York Ironworkers, 101.7 points. Cam Dolan and Colin Gross tied for that final 5th spot. Cam Dolan for NOLA racking up 92.8 fantasy points, and Colin Gross for OGDC racking up that same number. But you're seeing this list, like I said, each of them having a kind of a little bit of an X factor here. But let's start with Sam Gala and talk about the special season that he had. I mean, what a rookie season for Gala with the Dallas Jackals. Obviously, Dallas having a season again to forget, but man, if you're going to build a franchise around a guy, this might be the guy to do it, because this guy was special this season. 3 tries, 492 meters gained, 203 tackles, played. Again, started in all 15 matches, at least in the fantasy realm, and had 11 of them. He played 80 or more minutes, and we know how special that bonus point is when it comes to our fantasy scoring, especially at the second row position when points are hard to come by. And I think the thing, like we mentioned, that makes or at least the X factor for Sam Gala, is the 5 double-digit performances that he had throughout the season. You weren't getting double-digit performances from second-row players. He was able to get 5 of them, the most out of all second-row players, and a lot of that is attributed to that stat line he was able to get. 492 meters gained, 203 tackles is the big one. Sam Gala, guys, just a special season for the young kid.
Yeah, it's almost it's actually pretty crazy when you actually, for how dominant he was to only get 3 tries. Like if you extrapolate that, Dallas gets better, let's say he's a 6-7 try season. I mean, he's a guy that you're looking for, next draft. It's not saying Hunga Havili's not a guy you're searching for, but Sam Gala is a guy, at least for myself, that I'd be targeting for a second round, because he was the only second round that you could set and forget. The only one.
Yeah. And I mean, this is just kind of the glory, and we'll kind of see a trend throughout all these guys that we're seeing, are most of the guys in the top 5 of these second row players that have the ability or had the coming up, like Sam Gala at Cal, played back row. Right. He was a back row player, came in, kind of didn't know where he's going to fit into that second row position. Maybe played one game at back row, but
that's it.
You see the second row positions that have the athleticism to be a back row player, but have the ability to still have the physicality to be a second row, to play in the tight 5. And I think that we're seeing throughout this top 5, and especially with Sam Gala, with those tackles, with those meters gained, that a lot of those times, he was showing off his athleticism, and his athleticism was helping him out on the pitch and the fantasy scores and the fantasy points for the fantasy managers. I mean, he was a special guy to watch, and definitely, it's crazy the fact that we're looking at him as our top second row and probably our top second row player going into next year.
Yeah.
As, a sophomore next year.
Yeah. And I see Ryan alluded to it, that he only had 5 80-point performances. He only had one game under 70 minutes played. So he got, he was on the field more than every other second row. Just like I said, if Dallas can step it up, man.
And just another benefit of having the fitness of a back row.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
having
true.
The experience of playing back row. And we'll see it through. I mean, I think the only person that probably doesn't have the experience in back row, or experience kind of switching between second row and back row out of this top 5, is Johan Mumsen. And I mean, it just kind of shows, and I mean, Hamish Dalzell as well. But it just shows kind of how special those two guys were at their core position in comparison to some of these other guys who kind of had their opportunities in the back row position throughout the season. But yeah, it kind of shows maybe something to tee off and look for in the upcoming year as well.
Yeah, and I mean, also that athleticism shown. I mean, the most tackles out of all second row positions for Sam Gall as well, 203 tackles. And when you're getting from there, just consistent points being had. Had a season high performance, I believe, in round 7 with 15.6 fantasy points. And he was always hovering kind of around that double digit kind of mark as well. I mean, you got a 9-point performance in round 3, 9.5 in round 6, 9.7 in round 10. So that number of 5 double digit performances can easily sway, and just having that ability to get that amount of points from, again, a second row position that doesn't have that high ceiling of getting a whole bunch of points. You just want a little bit of consistency, I feel like, at the second row, and Sam Gala was definitely able to do that. But alluding to kind of what you're talking about, Matt, about the kind of the athleticism of having that back row experience. I mean, a guy that kind of reflects that perfectly here is the guy that's in second place here as the top fantasy second rower, is Hunga Havili, and he's a guy that played back row in this season, and he was able to capitalize on that. And I think that's something that fantasy managers are going to have a look at as well. If you can get a guy that has dual eligibility at this position, a guy that plays back row and has back row chances, but you're slotting him at that second row position, that is a huge advantage. And I mean, Hunga Havili was able to make 3 appearances this past season in that back row position. One of them being that mega 25.7 fantasy point performance in round 16, where he racked up 185 meters gained, 14 tackles. Pretty incredible stuff there. But yeah, just overall 117.6 points, like I said, for Hunga Havili, 2 tries, 649 meters gained, 104 tackles. Didn't have, I think the thing that kind of separated Sam Gala and Hunga Havili was the availability. I mean, you look at Sam Gala again, starting those 15 matches. Hunga Havili playing in 13, only starting 9, and I say only in quotations, just comparison to Sam Gala. Only had 60-80 minute plus matches out of those 9 matches that he played. So again, just availability there. But then you add in the 5 breakdown steals that Hunga Havili was able to get. It was a special season. I mean, again, you take out that 25.6 fantasy point performance, it maybe levels things out a little bit. But again, you're looking at guys that you're trying to reach that 100-point threshold, it seems like, for the second row position, and Hunga Havili was able to do that easily here, even with all that said.
And I mean, it kind of goes back to what Vandy was saying when he was talking about like the way that he was streaming second row position, because you can look at some of these guys, you can have a few guys, and if one of your second row players is starting in the back row for one of the games, the chances of you probably starting them in your lineup is pretty high, because having 2 back row players in your lineup is such a huge advantage. And you just have the higher opportunity to have those 25-point type games. To me, Hunga Havili was the type of guy who you didn't really have that consistency with him. You didn't really have that for sure points, but if he went off, right?
Yeah.
Like you see that he's got the 17-point game.
Yep.
He's got some, high single digit twinkled in there, but like, I think some of those really big games from him, the 17-point game, the 25-point game, those are the ones that kind of carried him up this ranking, and was something that, like, hey, that could have won you that week. That could have won you those couple weeks. And yeah, I mean, he didn't have the consistency, but definitely was a guy that you kind of streamed and was like, hey, maybe he'll go off today.
Well, the thing about Utah was we were so deep in that front pack position. We had such a good bench for it. But the one thing I would add to Hunga's performance is just you didn't have those really low dips. You didn't have the 1.9. He had 3.8 in week 1, and then other than that, he's been at least solid enough that I guess he'd be another guy if he was playing, if you've seen him in the starting lineup, even on the bench. I trusted Utah guys to come off the bench because a lot of our front pack played 60 minutes, 50 minutes, in that range.
And that's an interesting conversation to be had as well, because when you're looking at Hunga Havili, it's so nice to have that ability, to have that ceiling where you're going to get a random 17-point performance off. And you never know when it's going to happen too, right? You have Hunga Havili in your fantasy championship where he racks you up 25.6 fantasy points at the second row position. He's winning you the championship. He's winning you
that,
right?
For sure.
So there's not a lot of guys that can do that at this second row position, but at the same time, just the consistency of a guy like Sam Galla is so nice to have. So it's a balancing act in terms of that kind of profile that you want to build your team around. And again, a lot of this has to do with context as well. I mean, if you have your team and you're going into the 2024 fantasy MLR draft and you're starting to build your team and you're starting to realize that you have a lot of guys that are volatile or a lot of guys that are consistent, hey, maybe you take a shot at a Hunga Havili because that kind of rounds out your lineup, because you have a guy now that can kind of explode for a really big time performance. If you have a lot of volatile guys, a lot of guys that have high ceilings, low floors, hey, Sam Galla looks like a guy that might, or at least that player profile, because you're not getting a guy like Sam Galla later in the draft, not after this season.
No.
But you may look like at a player profile like that. So that is interesting. So let's shift on now to number 3, Johan Mumsen, the guy that we had going into the season as one of the top second rowers in the entire MLR. Racks up 104.5 points in the 2023 season. Pretty solid year. 2 tries, 446 meters gained, 168 tackles. Again, availability. 15 games he played in, 14 of them he started, and 11 of those 15 matches he played 80 plus minutes. So he was always on the field. The big thing here, I think, that makes it different from this season and last season, where he was just the unquestionable top second row player out of the league, was one, just didn't seem like he had those big time explosive meters gained numbers like he did last year. I believe he surpassed the 700 meter threshold in 2022, but this year not reaching that 500 meter mark at 446. And the big one, 28 turnovers, guys, for Johan Mumsen. You take even half of those away, this guy's teetering at that number 2 position, even close to that number 1 position. So again, Johan Mumsen has that ability, just a little bit of a shot in the foot there this year when it comes to just the total points he was able to get.
Yeah, I think this was probably just a product of kind of, Rugby Atlanta has been a much better team in the past seasons, and I think that clearly reflects in the players that play, especially in the positions when you're thinking about meters gained, when you're thinking about turnovers. Sure. Those are a couple things that when your team's doing well, those are some of the things that will just naturally you find yourself just having more of or having less of when it comes to turnovers. With Johan Mumsen, I think for me, at least when I was looking at him, it was like he's the captain. Expecting him to play almost every match and start almost every match, and if he starts, almost 90% of the time is going to finish them. That was the big thing for me, and that was kind of the nice consistency that you could get from him. And that was the nice consistency. And the fact that, Ryan, that you pointed out, the meters gained not really showing up in any of those stat categories of those meters gained, tackles, breakdown, steals, stuff like that, is probably the reason why we're seeing that drop off between, Sam Gala to Hunga Avili. Then we see another drop off from Hunga Avili to Johan Mumsen. And then once we get past Johan Mumsen, things kind of taper out and things are kind of getting a little bit closer. Now we're starting to get to those guys that, hey, maybe they're consistent, but they just didn't do anything that really went off the charts. And I think Johan Mumsen's kind of the best of the rest in that sense.
Yeah. Sure, yeah, and I think he kind of starts that, right? You look at his weeks, just really good, solid performances around, right? Yeah. He's teetering around that double-digit performance again, but just doesn't have any weeks where he had 15 points, where he had, close to 20 points. So yes, I think he's the beginning of the guys without that meters gain that we saw last season. Yeah. And you add the number of turnovers that he had this past year, he's just starting to become just a guy that just was solid for you, not amazing necessarily.
It was like I said, right? High floor, wishful ceiling.
Yeah.
That's what it was.
Exactly. All right. Well, let's shift on over now to kind of this next tier of players here. I think again, and you could maybe, it was a good season. I mean, Hamish Dalzell at number 4,
he
solid
was a sneaky
year.
One this year.
He was a sneaky one. Went undrafted in this past in our 2023 draft, but ended up being a guy that was definitely valuable. I mean, scored a try, 369 meters gain, 175 tackles. Again, you're seeing a common theme here outside of maybe Hunga Havili, that it's just guys that are very available. Started 14 out of the 15 matches that he appeared in, 9 80-plus minute matches. And then I thought something that hurt him kind of similar to Johan Mumsen, 14 turnovers as well. So you can imagine if you limit some of those, the point total could go up. So all of that racking and totaling up to 101.7 points. But yeah, I mean, an interesting name seeing on there. Obviously the first undrafted player that we're seeing on this list, a guy that we didn't expect to really have that performance this year, but slotting into the New York Ironworkers role and really embracing it and running with it, and ended up being definitely fantasy impactful here in 2023.
Yeah, I mean, I remember throughout the season, I think I picked him up a couple times, and throughout the season, I was just kind of figuring out, okay, what am I getting from him? What am I getting from him week to week? And as you look back, you're getting a very much similar thing that you expected from Johan Mumsen, right? You're getting this consistency from a position and from a guy in this position that you really, it was kind of hard to find. It was hard to come by outside of this top 6. And I mean, that's what you got to love about Hamish Dalzell, and the fact that he is one of like the few or the only really pure second row guys out of this top 5, top 6 list. It just shows, I think, just how valuable he was at this position as a pure kind of second row player. Maybe not as, you don't really care if you're a fantasy manager, you want the back row, second row split. But it was just crazy the fact that he was able to be top 4, purely sitting at just purely playing second row all season.
Yeah. Well, that's even like a fine line there when you have back row eligibility, because I'm sure Ryan was going to talk about it, but we had 2 second row players that lost their eligibility. To the back row.
Luke White and Ben Landry, both of them, they were playing second row all season except for the last 6 weeks. So
yeah,
they easily could have been on this list.
So that's one thing. As nice as it is, it's also a fine line. And there was moments last year when I had Joe Peterson, and he would lose his fly half eligibility and become a fullback, and that was a killer in a position like that. Second row, it doesn't matter as much, but it's still something to take, not to take for granted that he's. Like you said, Matt, that he's a pure second row, because then there's no fear.
That's true.
You see a guy like, even Hunga Havili starts 2 back row games in a row, and you're like, oh man, come on, don't be 3, because then he's not a second row anymore.
Right. And if he's a guy that's you're slotting in your lineup every single week, and that third week comes where he's not playing at that second row position, you're now left in the dust trying to figure out what you're going to do at that second row position. So no, that's definitely a good point. So again, a really fine line. You're walking that tightrope.
Yeah.
And I can imagine you owning Hunga Havili and Sweat.
Yeah, exactly, because he was such a dominant second row.
And we know how shoddy sometimes the MLR lineups can be. So I just sweating and sitting on that starting line and come up, seeing where Hunga Havili will go.
That's a shout out to you, Rugby Atlanta. Post your damn lineups.
Yeah. So I mean, Hamish Dalzell again. I like to think of him as kind of a poor man's Johan Mumsen. I think this past season.
Yeah,
but
that's a good one.
I mean, hey, like what 3? He finished 3 points behind Johan Mumsen. Like. Yep. I would say that he was we only look at him that way because we didn't really talk about him. He was so just.
He didn't have those explosives. You know what I mean?
He was just so single digit consistent. And probably the fact that the only reason we really talked about Johan Malmsteen was because he was probably on my team. That's the only reason.
And I mean, hey, you can't take for granted though. I think there's a little bit of a resume there. You saw what Johan Malmsteen was able to do in 2022. So you're hoping for that. You have that wishful ceiling, Matt. We don't know right now what the ceiling is for Hamish Dalzell. Next year, there's a question mark. You know, if you're drafting Hamish Dalzell, which I'm sure he'll go now, definitely won't be going undrafted, that's for sure. If everything stays the same with the New York Ironworkers. You don't know if he has that same ability as Johan Malmsteen to get those meters gained. We've seen Johan Malmsteen hit that 700-meter mark last season. Obviously, merited it was with a better Rugby Atlanta team. But hey, they're moving to LA, like we said in the news portion of the show. So it could be a completely different team. And hey, maybe they hit that form again and enjoy that California heat. And Johan Malmsteen is right back up there in the 700 meters game mark. But it'll be interesting to see because Hamish Dalzell, we'll see whether or not he has that ability. Or hey, maybe it's Johan Malmsteen regressing to the mean here and is basically what Hamish Dalzell is. It'll be interesting. All right, our two top 5 player guys here now shifting on. 2 guys tied at 92.8 fantasy points, which always amazes me. The fact that they can literally
tie point,
exactly. Just it's a different ways to do it. The stats aren't the same, but somehow they get the exact same number, not even a 0.1 off. But Cam Dolan coming in at the first number 5 here for the NOLA Gold. This is a guy that's always been a long time staple name of Major League Rugby. This past season, a try, 384 meters gain, 103 tackles. The big one here that really pushed him up is that ability at that breakdown to turn over the ball, 4 steals, and again, availability. I'm starting to sound like a broken record here, but 13 out of 14 games started. And he also had 2 try assists, which was nice as well. But I think, again, Matt, like you kind of alluded to earlier, this is where we see a drop off in another tier here. Cam Dolan is kind of that next level of guy that, you know, he'll get you points. But again, I don't think it's anything that's going to win you any weeks. He just might not lose you a week per se.
Yeah, well, you see a lot of 4s, 3s, 2.7, 4.5. You know, I guess at this point you've lost your. Well, I shouldn't say that. You got 115.2 game, but I mean, outside of that, you know, you lose that big explosive factor. He's not going to steal you a week, but he's, like you just said, he's not going to lose it for you necessarily.
Yeah, and I mean, like Danny, when you brought up, this is a guy that probably had, you know, any owner of like, hey, you have him at second row eligibility for 4 weeks.
Yeah.
He starts back row for 3 weeks in a row. Right? You lose that, and he doesn't gain second row eligibility back until the last 2 games of the fantasy season, right?
Yeah.
So
scary going into the playoffs.
It's kind of like, hey, look,
like
you get the points, you get the higher points, the higher upside, the higher ceiling in those games that he's starting at back row. But to your point with him, I mean, you have that kind of worry that, look, where am I going to play this guy? Is he better than my back row starter already? Yep. Or is it something that I need to kind of, is he going to be sitting on my bench even though he's peaking at this time?
Yep.
But
because he was good enough. Because he was good enough, you can't drop these guys. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly.
Second row is so sparse for talent that you can't really drop them. But then in those situations, you're almost stuck with them.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, to your guys' point, it's kind of like, this is where we get to the guys that are all over the place, right? You don't know what you're going to get from them. You hope you have a decent week, and you really hope that they have a great week.
Yeah.
Versus the guys that we talked about before, you know that you're going to get a decent week, and you hope they have a great week. So yeah, I mean, when we get to these next 2 guys, it's kind of a lot of that.
Yeah. And I will say, I mean, we've seen spurts of Cam Dolan, what he's done in the past in the league. I mean, in 2022, he was a back row player, basically solely. So seeing him shift to that second row position this past season was an interesting one. And there was maybe a level of expectation here where maybe he can, you know, kind of do something like that at that second row position. He started the first 2 matches at back row, shifts over that second row position. I mean, he was drafted in the 7th round at that 7th pick. So there was some value to be had there in terms of what the expectation was. But we're starting to get to that normal tier. Now, I will say, when it's interesting because when we compare these second row players and the makeup of that to the front row players we had last week, you're not seeing as big of a drop off.
No.
You know what I mean? Like the difference between the top front row player and kind of the middle link front row players in that kind of ranking versus the top second row players and the middle link second row players, it's not that big of a points difference. A lot of that has to do with what Matt was alluding to earlier in this conversation about how you kind of have an easier time predicting with this front row position because you kind of match that up with the set piece, and there's only a limited number of front row players that are going to really take advantage of those set piece plays. And once you get outside of that, the points really drop off. Second row has a little bit more involvement outside of those set piece areas, so you're not seeing as big of a drop off. So maybe it's a thing that you're taking to next season with saying, hey, you know, if I miss out on a Sam Gala, it's not the end of the world. You know what I mean?
Well,
like you don't need to emphasize as much.
I don't know about that because I think for the second rows, I think where you're getting the drop off is at the top. The big drop offs is from Sam Gala to Hunga Avili, from Hunga Avili to Johan Mumsen. That's where we're seeing the drop off.
Right.
After that, things are tapering out. Whereas the front row, it was, hey, the top three, the difference isn't that high. But once you get past the top 3 or 4, that's where the drop off comes.
Sure.
Here, it's kind of almost different. It's almost like, hey, I value a Sam Gala because if I get a Sam Gala, there's going to be nobody close. The next best second row is going to be nowhere close to where Sam Gala is going to be. Right. And I think that's actually where maybe the one where you're actually like, Sam Gala, big guy to get your hands on. Maybe after Sam Gala, you know, it's not more so, oh, whatever. It's more so of like, all right, it's tapering out. If I don't get these two guys at the top, I can wait. Instead of reaching at the 4th round, I can wait all the way till the last round and kind of get a guy that's maybe, you know, 5 or 10 points behind the top 6 guy.
Well, it's interesting because I think that's only going to make their draft value skyrocket even more. Yeah. It's going to make someone even more willing to reach on a Sam Gala higher and take him earlier than expected because of that drop off that happened so quickly. You can kind of relate it, Vandy. I know your experience in fantasy football, kind of in the tight end position, right? Like you really have just like 2 or 3 tight ends that are really at the top, and then it just goes off. So that's why we saw
that with Dean Muir, right?
Right.
We saw that with Dean Muir in last year's draft. It was like, where did this come out of the 1st round pick?
Right.
It was because he's Dean Muir, and that's what you expect.
Yeah. All right, and then to round out this top 5 here, again, tied with Cam Dolan with 92.8 fantasy points. Colin Gross, pretty solid season. Again, another guy that went undrafted, a guy that we didn't see really taking a stranglehold of that position that we thought. But yeah, did a great job with Old Glory DC. 2 tries, 246 meters gained, 154 tackles. Again, a pretty solid at that breakdown with 4 breakdown steals, and availability was a big part of that as well. Started 11 of the 15 matches for Old Glory and added the 2 tries there. So again, kind of just a guy that you can throw in the mix that is solid for you, but you could probably wait on in drafts.
Yeah, and I mean, look, I'm not surprised he didn't go undrafted. That's the second rookie in this second row list. You know, I think he made a name for himself this year, and in some weeks he almost had a conversation of being, you know, up for rookie of the year, right up there with Sam Gala. So not surprised that he's found himself in the top 5 or top 6 here. For second rows because he had a stellar season. But I think it's crazy the fact that, you know, we're seeing 2 rookies.
Yeah, it's true.
2 rookies in this top 5. And I don't know if we're going to see that again next year, you know, after that conversation with Fitzy. But I mean, we'll have to see. But I think it's crazy the fact that we got Sam Gala, Colin Gross, 2 rookies sitting in our top 5 for second row fantasy.
Absolutely. All right. So to recap, Sam Gala at number 1, 135.6 fantasy points. Hunga Havili, 117.6 fantasy points at that number 2 spot. Johan Mumsen, 104.5 points at number 3. At number 4, we got Hamish Dalzell with 101.7, and tied at that 5th spot, Cam Dolan and Colin Gross with 92.8 fantasy points. If I had to put a tier base on it right now, I think Sam Gala is in a tier of his own when it comes to the second row position. I think you can put Hunga Havili and maybe Johan Mumsen in there, and Hamish Dalzell in that kind of tier 2 area, and then you got Cam Dolan, Colin Gross in kind of that tier 3 for that second row position there as well. A quick question before, like we just did last week, we're obviously going to show now Matt and my predictions, and this one was a tough one. It's even worse than what it was like for the front rowers. Just so many names here that we did not expect, and I will say, injury did have a part to play in it, and we'll get to it in just a moment in time. But when you see this, I mean, kind of like that Dean Muir conversation, Matt, that you're talking about. How much higher do you think is Sam Galla going to go in the draft than any other second rower when it comes to the 2024 fantasy season?
I don't think he has the Dean Muir effect. Dean Muir was crazy.
Oh, he was ridiculous.
Dean Muir scored, I think, 11 tries.
Yeah.
Or something like that in the season before. So that was a bit of an outlier. I think, I think I think I was probably the first guy to take a second row off the board in the fourth round. So I can see him going in the third round.
That's what I was thinking. Third, fourth.
I guess that's a good question. Is over under the fourth round is Sam Galla?
I think
that's over.
A sweet spot. Yeah, I mean, but we look at Sam Galla and we look at him being a staple of the Dallas Jackals for a long time. Just the way to break into the league like that and the way that he did. Whenever you watch the Dallas Jackals play, he had an impact somehow, some way. And that's something that you kind of just love to see and something that was unreal to watch.
I'd put money on it when Gomez VAR is done. He's going to be the captain now.
Yeah.
That's not surprising. I mean, yeah.
Put $20 on it. Let's go. I'll bet you.
Come on, buddy.
All right. Well, hey, let's bring it up
now.
This
is brutal.
Let's bring on the Matt and Ryan's predictions heading into the 2023 season. Yeah, this one was a little bit rough. We obviously got that Johan Mumsen pick, but after that one, kind of fallen off here. Obviously, Mumsen, like we mentioned, didn't have the same kind of season that we saw in 2022. Didn't have that meters gained, partly due to, I guess, a lacking Rugby Atlanta side that we saw in difference from 22 to 23. But from there, I mean, it falls off. And again, I'm going to say here, at least when you look at my prediction list here, and you compare it to Matthews as well, I mean, Stan South,
I can't justify mine. I can't justify it.
Tough to see Stan South. I mean, a lot of these guys, right? Stan South for me, Josh Larson for me, really banking on those hits and just injury hand. But let me read it out for the podcast listeners here. So for my predictions, have Johan Mumsen at 1, Stan South at 2, Josh Larson at 3, Yuri Van Vuren at 4, and Ben Mitchell at 5. For Matt, he's got Johan Mumsen at 1, Stan South at 2, Ben Mitchell at 3, Liam Hallam Ames at 4, and then Yuri Van Vuren at 5. So let's break it down the list, Matt and Vandy. You're the moderator here, and again, I think after the end of this week, Matt and I are still going to remain tied. So we'll see whether or not next week's back row ranks is going to shake that up by any bit. But I mean, you can't argue this Johan Mumsen pick. I mean, everything was pointing in the right direction when it comes to him being the top second rower heading into the 2023 year. Still, you weren't disappointed, I don't think, Matt. I mean, you owned him. I don't think you were disappointed with the performance that he had in 2023, finishing off as the second row 3. He just didn't give you that boom type performance that you were kind of hoping for in some weeks.
I mean, we both saw him. And I think we had this conversation. We both saw him as like, this guy is going to be the, he's the one guy.
He was the Sam Galla. He was the Sam Galla that we thought.
He was a head above everybody else. And we didn't get that from him this year. And you know what, like we've already said, it's kind of just due to the Rugby Atlanta side being not the usual Rugby Atlanta side. And now they're going to go die in LA. But like, I think that just is what it is. Yeah, not much else. We already talked a lot about him in the top 5, but I think the second one for both of us, Rye. Yeah, this one was a tough one.
How many games did he play? One game?
One
game. He played the first game, full game, and then his knee blew up.
Yeah,
and
Larson.
We're talking about Stan South. Ended up finishing off as the second row 52. Sad to see. I mean, a career-ending injury resulted in him calling it, hanging up the boots and calling retirement at the end of here. But I mean, we were banking on obviously his appearances. We're banking on his hits.
Yeah, in the one game, I mean, in the one game he had, he showed exactly.
Yeah, looked good.
What we expected, right? Like we didn't care about meters gained. He got 18 tackles in the first game.
We'll count that as right. Well, you extrapolate that out to 15 matches.
I mean, that's 150 something points, and I mean, like, that if we weren't wrong there looking at last year's stats, it's just our top 5 just got either hit with injuries. Or, I mean, actually, most of mine was just with either or bad play. But Stan South was one, Ryan, that I think we can say, all right, we did what we could. You can't predict knees blowing up. And Stan South, I mean, he's out there enjoying retirement. So
yeah. Well, I mean, also then to that kind of leads into my third pick here. I mean, Josh Larson, another guy that was impacted by injury, played round one, had the I believe the or played round one, played round two, had the bye, played round four, and he was done after that. I believe suffering an injury in that round four matchup, which ended his 2023 campaign, finishing off as the second of 46. So again, I'm gonna mark it up to injury. I don't think I can say the same though with his performances. You look at his round one, round two. I mean, he was around 5.1, 7.7. So nothing particularly great, but again, injury kind of hurting me there at that 3 spot. But for you, Ben Mitchell, who you had 3, I had Ben Mitchell at the 5 spot. Just not the performance that we thought, and just not what we thought he would do.
And I forget whether we did this before or after it was announced he was going to Seattle Seawolves, but I think he just ended up not playing as much as we expected him to.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think he was injured, and I could be wrong, but I don't think that he was hurt.
Nothing that I
think it was just the Seattle depth kind of weeded him out of the lineup. And, you know, it was something that we probably should have foreseen if he was on the Seattle Seawolves, but it was hard to not put him in the top 5 after the season that he had last year with the San Diego Legion. It was difficult to leave him out, and you kind of just had to. So I don't regret it. It was awfully wrong, but yeah, I can't say the same about my next one.
All right, so coming at number 4 for me, I had Yuri Van Vuren, finishing off as the second row 17. So still pretty okay. Just not what we thought he was going to do.
This is kind of down to what Vandy said, right? Like, I think Utah had a deep forward pack. They had a strong forward pack. And Yuri Van Vuren had like the pedigree from the past. I think he just ran into a really hot lineup and just couldn't find his way into it personally. And I mean, he got off the bench on most of his games, and it was kind of tough for him to really crack in and make an impact most of the time when you look at his minutes.
Yeah, I had him at the 4 spot. Matt, you had him at the 5 spot. So I guess the last player that we'll talk about is the guy that you have at the 4, Liam Hallam-Ames. A lot of expectation here. He was kind of your sleeper pick. Finishes off as the second row 21. Comes from a high pedigree. Just didn't translate over to Major League Rugby.
Yeah, I mean, and I did make a note or an effort to try and pick at least one guy from one new guy from overseas, a international player that was new to the league, in every one of my top 5s, and Liam Hallam-Ames is one of them. Yeah, I mean, I loved watching him in Super Rugby, and that's why I put him in. I think it was a couple things probably. You know, his season didn't go that great. His impact, his performance in the games, he was really a low double-digit fantasy scorer. And I don't think it was just fantasy wise. I think just his impact in some of the games just wasn't what you expected. He didn't play some of them. He got subbed out a lot of them. And it was unfortunate, really. And then also I think it was unfortunate the fact that he was on Nola Gold. And, you know, we saw Nola Gold season, even though it has its highs, it had its very, very lows. And all the players get kind of hurt from that, especially the second row.
Yeah. So I think Matt, you and I are learning very quickly that this whole prediction thing is pretty tough. So if we continue the points ranking, obviously last week we had the front row predictions. We both got Dylan Fawcett in there. That was the only one we got, so we were tied 1-1. This week, same thing. Got Johan Mumsen.
I'm not giving any points.
We're 2-2, baby. So we're still tied, Matt. Tough one
you're
here.
0-2.
0-2.
We're 0-2. All right, bud.
Fair enough. 0-2.
You're lucky I'm even giving you an 0-0 and anything after that one.
Stink, man.
No kidding.
Those are 2 tough weeks, and honestly, it's not getting any better. If you think it's getting better,
I guess we'll find out, and that's what we get next week. We get the back row
at the
players.
9 position, baby. Actually, no.
Well, we have the back row position coming up next week, which is a fun one. I think this is where the conversation starts to get interesting because we talk about the front row, we talk about the second row. Again, important positions to consider in these fantasy lineup builds, but just not the most what's the word? Just not the most, doesn't have the most wow or X factor in terms of having these explosive weeks. This is where we start to see the points. This is where we start to see the guys that are really making impact for you on a weekly basis in your fantasy lineup. Front row, second row is kind of a nice position to have if you have a top guy, and you try to pick a guy that's just not going to lose you a week. But this is where we start getting into the game changers. Back row position is going to be a lot of fun to break down next week. The predictions may not get any better, but the point totals here that we're going to start to see and the breakdown of the stats are going to be a lot of fun to break down in the next week.
Yeah, and I mean, right after back row, we go right back to halfback, so the points come right back down after that. But so it'll come right back level with predictions. But yeah, the back row is going to be a good time. I think it will be surprised with some of the top fives. I think we'll have lots to talk about, and I think it's just we're going to see a crazy, just some unbelievable performances out of that back row position from probably some unlikely faces that we didn't really see going into it at the start of the year.
Absolutely. So yes, the fantasy rankings reveal continues this offseason. Back row coming up next week, going to be a whole lot of fun. Thank you again to John Fitzpatrick of Rugby Morning for joining us to break down that collegiate draft and give us a little bit of insight into what to expect and what we should feel about this draft, because it's been confusing this season. It's been hard to kind of gauge. But again, I think we've learned a whole lot more to give us some knowledge heading into the 2024 fantasy season. And again, always interesting to break down these second rowers, and got back rows coming up next week. All right, guys, it was another good one. Anything else to say to the people before we head out?
Nope, just tune in next week, baby.
All right. All right. Well, for Devin Vandy Vanderpool, for Matt Yee, I'm Ryan Yee, and the Fantasy Ruckers will be back next week.
Let's go.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.